Well, in our discussion of Locke in the last lecture module, I noted that the fundamental metaphorical way of thinking about ideas was as pictures as opposed to, say, propositions. But there was another way, I think, that shaped the way that Locke thought about ideas. I think another guiding metaphor for Locke in contemplating ideas is that ideas are things. They come into the mind and you manipulate them like a model of the world in order to think about the world itself. And this, in a way, is consistent with the idea of atoms as physical objects. In my experience, at least, there are passages in the essay concerning human understanding where he seemed to oftentimes talk about the functioning of the mind as though you were in a room moving things around or pushing things around in a mental cupboard. But as we move progressively through the British empiricists, the notion of an isolated and imagistic idea starts to take hold in the thinking of the empiricists, leading them farther and farther away from that original corpuscularian view without abandoning the chemistry aspect of it. Hume shares Locke's project of understanding the nature of the mind in order to understand the nature, sources, and limits of knowledge. However, Hume's primary tie to empirical science is that he attempts to incorporate observations in a systematic manner in his thought about his ontological framework. So he reflects upon observations as opposed to being guided by a particular scientific picture or a particular kind of scientific methodology. And that's what drives his theorizing in works like A Treatise of Human Nature and An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. Now, as a result of Hume's rarefication of the notion of an idea as an isolated instance, an isolated and hermetically sealed instance as opposed to a substantive depiction, Hume ultimately comes to associate the information represented by an idea not with the object in the world that caused it so much as with the associations that we form between the ideas once they have entered into the mind. So for Hume, our notion of an object is really a synthesis, a cause and effect association between different experiences that are similar in their temporal and spatial positioning to each other, for instance. As a result, Hume ultimately concludes that there is no basis for claiming that we have knowledge of physical objects or even of causal relationships between them. Hume argues for this extensively in both the treatise and the inquiry, and the arguments consist primarily of looking at what is clear and distinct in a particular imagistic idea, looking at whether or not those cause and effect relationships can be established through that, which he denies, but also looking at whether or not we can establish them through rational intuition, which he also denies. Like Locke before him, he develops his psychology around that notion that ideas come from experience, adding some complications but keeping that basic picture. And he likewise seeks to ground his theorizing upon experience and sort of experiments. Unfortunately, though his notion of incorporating experience and experimentation strives towards a systematic collection of data, it usually falls under the category of anecdotal experience and counterfactual thought experiments. By the time we get to Bishop Berkeley and his treatise concerning the principles of human knowledge and three dialogues between Hylas and Philonous, we find that he's articulating the third major ontological framework, namely monistic substance idealism. Berkeley divorces ideas entirely from physical substance and argues that only mental substance exists and that all properties are mental properties. Mental and physical properties, then, are modifications of mental substances that are exchanged between ourselves and one another, perhaps, but definitely from God.